Hi, I'm Tom Purchard. I teach in the Department of Music at Goldsmiths, University of London, and I'm a researcher on the history of jazz and popular music. I'm also the author of a study of jazz in post-war France called After Django. And over the course of the next few posts, I'm going to explore some of the themes that I find really interesting and I think are really important about the history of jazz in France and across the world. So as we probably know by now, James Reese Europe arrives in France in January 1918 with his regimental band, the Harlem Hellfighters. And over the course of the next couple of months, they tour the country and they play in around 25 towns and cities. It's become almost mythologized as the moment in which jazz meets the world. Jazz's first appearance in France, jazz's first appearance outside the USA. There's a great amount of truth to that. But a point I want to make in this introductory video is that, in a sense, James Reese Europe was kind of plugging into a circuit of meanings and expectations and kind of cultural values that already existed. So actually, the first really extended experience of African American music more broadly in France and in many other countries in Europe came during the 1870s with the tour of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. That was most people's first experience of spirituals and of a particular kind of African American music making which struck people as remarkably different at the time. Later on in Paris in 1903, Will Marion Cook's operetta In Dahomey was a huge success. And that was the first time that Parisian audiences came into contact with this vaudeville tradition which was so strongly established in African American culture and life at that time. Around the same time, there was the cakewalk craze, and during the 1910s and then 1920s, there was a procession of visiting African American musicians who played in or led bands in casinos, theatres, clubs, bars, and so on. Now, as jazz became more established in France, different kinds of values were attached to different forms. In France, as in the United States and as in Britain, two strands emerged quite quickly. On the one hand, symphonic jazz, a popular dance band idiom in which certain kinds of jazz rhythm or jazz sonority were incorporated into something which was often criticised at the time, actually, by jazz diehards as being too smooth and too commercial. The jazz diehards, on the other hand, were proselytizers for hot jazz, most obviously connected or identified with Louis Armstrong. It's a point worth making here because it's a dynamic that we see throughout the history of music, throughout the history of popular music, especially really the history of African American musics and outside the US. We see it absolutely with hip-hop in the 1980s and 90s, this idea of an authentic product, an authentic jazz or an authentic hip-hop versus a commercialized version of the same. Now, a point I want to make here is that although these two camps emerged quickly, the commercial and the authentic, things had always been more complicated than that. And James Reese Europe's music shows us how. He's become known as this pioneer of jazz, but his own music was a combination of light classical adaptations, jigs, reels, other kinds of dance, certainly jazz rhythm, bits of improvisation and elaboration, and so on. And he was a staunch defender of this kind of mix. The point is that musicians very often think different things about their music than critics or audiences want to think. The kinds of meanings that were placed onto jazz, were projected onto jazz in France and around the world, often said something about French society itself as much as it did about jazz. So I'm just going to raise a couple of themes that I'm interested in that I'm going to be exploring. Firstly, that one. What did the music mean for its musicians? Secondly, what did it mean for French listeners? How did French listeners and musicians interpret, remake, imagine, fantasize jazz? What did it represent to them? Thirdly, I want to think a bit about the ways that critics and the intelligentsia, the culturati, figured jazz, placed it in the French cultural terrain, if you like. There's very few more sophisticated and early to develop music critical cultures than there is in France. And it's very interesting the ways that jazz is often made to stand for something much bigger than itself, even in the 1920s. I'll explore what I mean by that a little bit later, but for now, a couple of big themes. Very often, from the 1920s onwards really, jazz is taken as saying something about America. James Reese Europe arrives, obviously, right at the end of the First World War, and in the post-war reconstruction moments, first after the First World War, but then after the Second World War in the 1950s, jazz becomes intertwined with an idea of America. America, this all-dominant cultural force, a political and economic force, obviously, which is at once tantalizing and fascinating, but also kind of frightening to those Europeans who are living in utterly ruined countries in the 1920s and again in the 1950s. People are trying to rebuild their society, and music is often figured as one way of doing that. Our European culture is dead, or we've sent so many people to be slaughtered, we have to remake ourselves. How are we going to do that? What's the most culturally vivacious, most interesting, most 20th century way of living? Jazz often represents that. So that's the second theme, actually, this idea of modernity. Very often critics and sometimes listeners will say, I've had enough of classical music, this romantic stuff, which doesn't represent life today, the speed, the technology, the rhythm, so on and so forth. Jazz represents modernity to French people, to French culture, tastemakers, if you like. The last theme, and perhaps the most important, is around race and blackness, the African American experience. It's a very complicated theme. There are three things I want to pick out very quickly. Firstly, the ways that race was fantasized in a positive way. For the early proponents of jazz, blackness that they saw, they heard, this kind of African American mastery of instrument and music, was something to be celebrated. But it was also a way of projecting ideas of otherness onto other people. So even though the early proponents and proselytizers for jazz were often making very strongly argued cases for the worth of jazz, it was often done at the expense of African American musicians who had to be fantasized into these kinds of superhumans. The second way that race appears is in a negative way. Lots of times the same kinds of ideas were flipped on their head, and a negative racist collection of tropes combined to say, look at this degraded music, this kind of culture that we need to resist in order to protect true French or European culture. The third way that race is important emerges a bit later on, during the post-colonial movements of the 1950s and 60s. At that point, jazz listeners and musicians, these are people who had spent a long time thinking about otherness because they've been playing music strongly identified with African American experience. At that point, they start to think about what it is to be French in a post-colonial world. As the colonies and territories that had been held by France in the Caribbean, in Asia and in North Africa sought and then gained independence, you can see in jazz culture a new idea of politicized music making, politicized music discourses that take the ideas that they are reading in post-colonial political work and apply them to music making. This is all in the service of a rethinking of jazz's place in France and France's place in the world.